Um, Hello, everybody. I just wanted to say that I am really sorry that I can't be there, that family circumstances have meant that I have to not be there in person. And I hope that by recording these talks, you'll be able to get something of them nonetheless. I would not have had to head home unless it had been kind of crisis situation. So I hope you can kind of understand that, and hopefully some of the resources provided at the end of this talk will be able to kind of enrich what it is that I'm going to talk about. So I also will say that with that context, I am slightly discombobulated and my energy levels are quite low and a bit all over the place. So please bear with me as I occasionally lose my place and my train of thought if that happens throughout the talk. Um, so I am speaking to you from the context of Aotearoa and Auckland, and I am Braun, or Ginny Braun, and I'm Professor in the School of Psychology, Te Kuramātai Hinengaro at Waipapa Taumata or the University of Auckland. And I'm going to talk about quality measures for qualitative research. And I've provocatively titled this What Really Matters and Why. But I want you to take away from this that really this is a sort of starting point for thinking rather than giving you the answers. You're not going to get the answers from this session. Um, so how does this focus on thinking about quality specifically come about? My regular collaborator and I, Victoria Clark, and I took to recently reviewing thematic analysis publications. And this came about partly because we did a review in health psychology that was kind of systematic across a number of publications. And then we got invited to do editorials or reviews for another number of health journals, Trans Healthcare, International Journal for Trans Healthcare, Palliative Medicine, and Health Promotion. So kind of related but different fields. And in these, we noted a number of what seemed to be repeated problematic practices. And when we talk about problematic practices, they're not problematic practices in and of themselves universally per se necessarily, but they were problematic in that people were claiming to be publishing reflexive thematic analysis. They claimed to be following the guidelines or to have followed the guidelines and to be doing something that was methodologically congruent with what we'd written about and advised and so on, and then reporting something quite different and sometimes at odds. And this led us to really sort of ponder this question of why does this happen? And, how can this come to be? And how can we provide resources that might be better able to sort of support more congruous and better quality reporting practices? So in some ways, the questions of why were questions of, is this a result of methodologically incongruous reviewing? A reviewer's kind of asking authors to make changes and claim things that the authors themselves haven't done or haven't thought about. And we know anecdotally that this happens, and we also know from research that this happens. We've got a publication that's about to come out any day now. Or is it sometimes maybe that the inappropriate quality requirements and expectations have been put in place? Or is it due to misunderstandings, lack of resourcing, and so on? So today I'm going to try and unpack a little bit of that question of why, but not so much, but then think about sort of strategies for circumventing or hopefully circumventing this. So let's start on a more positive and upbeat note. Qualitative research of a whole range of kinds can be described as flourishing. It's more widely accepted across more disciplines, and there's simply more of it. There's a vast array of different approaches that get used, different developments, new approaches, flexibility, variability, and so on. And that's just within the relatively traditional Western social sciences. And if you go beyond the Western social sciences, to creative, indigenous, and various other versions of qualitative, or into the domain or realm of post-qualitative, or arts-based creative research on the sort of materialist, post-humanist traditions, there's also all sorts of expansions and explosions of ideas and things like that about what knowledge is, how knowledge can and should and could and would be generated, and our role in it as researchers and the relationships on which it draws. And that is wonderful. That is something we should be celebrating. What we can confidently, I guess, say is that there is no best way, no single best way to generate knowledge that is removed from the context and the purpose of that knowledge generation. And that's regardless of whether it's qualitative or quantitative or some mix in between. But of this vast and flourishing field, coming from a perspective as qualitative methodologists, we would say not all qualitative research is quality. The same can be certainly said for quantitative research. And there are various points of challenge or context which kind of prove, I think, difficult for quality and qualitative research. So Denzin, who recently passed, and Lincoln and Giardina and Canella in the latest iteration of their Handbook of Qualitative Inquiry, noted that challenges still remain despite the groundwell of support for the use of qualitative methods across a wide range of paradigmatic and ideological approaches. There is challenges, and for them one of the challenges was the pressure, a neoliberal corporate commercial approach to research, which requires scholars and authors to have accountabilities that may not necessarily be in the interests of the best quality or integrity of the research that they're doing, and where a range of performance indicators and indeed hurdles and roadblocks may get in the way. So this might be felt very specifically in relation to our own research context, but it's part of the broader context in which we are, as scholars, expected to produce more and to publish in certain journals more than others, because those journals have some kind of quality criteria that may be irrelevant to the type of research we're doing, and so on. So there's this broader context of the university. If we're working in different contexts from universities, it may be different. There's another challenge, which is a bit of a different challenge, which is that journal publication norms also often are not derived and oriented to what suits qualitative research. So if we think about the length of journal articles, if we're doing medical research, often they're really, really short. And as a qualitative researcher, they just break my heart because I feel like I can barely get through a kind of introduction to the complexity and nuance of what I'm exploring before the end of the word length, let alone report in depth the research. In the American Psychological Association's review of publication standards, I'm a psychology person, and the American Psychological Association's very influential internationally as well as in North America, and they argued that qualitative research should be given at least 10 extra pages than quantitative research in order to report with integrity and to allow the richness and depth of the analytic insights to be conveyed. But very few journals actually do this. The Journal of Counselling Psychology is one that has been noted as offering more pages available for qualitative research, but often the word counts are singular, and so qualitative researchers have to decide an attention between length and depth often, and some of those neoliberal pressures that I've talked about. Then there's also what has been talked about by Tracy as the 4-act play of research reporting, which is a style where we have an introduction and literature review, and then we describe our robust methodological approach. We, in a fairly neutral and objective way, describe our results or our findings, and then we provide an analytic interpretation of those in a discussion section. And this style has developed out of more sort of positivist empiricist and quantitative approaches to research, and it suits those quite well. But in qualitative research, it doesn't necessarily suit the way qualitative research flows, the kinds of things we might want to say. And, if you find yourself in a situation as a qualitative scholar, when I have to, for instance, separate out my results and my discussion, I find it very hard to separate out the kind of analytic and interpretative things I want to say about the data from the actual kind of reporting of the findings. So this style can be an awkward fit, I think, at best for much qualitative research. Not all, but it can be a difficulty and a challenge, and it can require us to fit our work into a format that doesn't fit well. So perhaps thinking of that famous fairy tale of Cinderella and the quote unquote ugly stepsister trying to fit a foot that doesn't fit into a shoe. And maybe qualitative research can be a bit like that. So in terms of broader context, there are those sorts of challenges to quality. And I think if we think about quality overall and the different aspects and components that relate to quality, we also need to think about which aspects we want to give attention to and why. So I was trying to sort of basically think about what I think relates to quality. And I think in a qualitative puzzle for quality, we have what we understand qualitative to be, what we know and bring to the research, what our disciplinary and other contexts are, because there's so much variation and nuance there. We have to also bring in our research purpose, our values, our specific design, the sort of practices that we engage in as scholars, the quality measures that we decide to deploy in our research, and the reporting practices that we engage in. And there's other aspects as well, but these are all important in different ways. I am going to touch on some of these more than others tonight, but all of them are kind of interconnected and not entirely removable from each other. So, given that I won't be able to see whether you are snoozing through this or not, what I do want to say is the key takeaway for me, for Victoria, as we've thought about this, as we've engaged in this, the key to qualitative quality is two aspects. One is an understanding or an orientation to what we will call methodological congruence, but which some others refer as methodological integrity or methodological coherence, and what I will talk about as a knowingness and an orientation to knowingness. And this can be kind of conveyed as being thoughtful or full of thought as you engage with research and as you engage with quality measures and quality criteria. So we will get to that a little bit more as we go through. So hopefully it will make sense and you won't snooze and it will all be good. I think fundamentally the most important starting point really is a question of what do we even mean by qualitative? And, qualitative, quantitative is a kind of tired and old, overdone, overstated differentiation, but yet it still kind of happens and it still applies and so on. So the basic dichotomy between the two, between the qual and the quant, is problematic, but it often serves as a shorthand. And when it serves as a shorthand, qualitative there becomes an umbrella term for not just a diverse array of methods, specific methods of data generation and data analysis, but a diverse array of paradigms or a diverse array of research values or epistemologies and ontologies and so on. And I think one thing that qualitative methodologists might agree on above all else is the sheer diversity within qualitative inquiry. But from there, I don't think there is much agreement as to how we should pass out um, that that variation. So let's think about the ways in which the qualitative research domain has been mapped. There are so many different ways that this could be, and I'm going to show you a few, some of which are quite. Let me just pause for a moment and I will come back to you. Some, but they will be different depending on the context and the domain that you work with in. And I think one of the things I just want to say about this is that some people kind of make definitive statements about, like, you know, these are the different approaches, or these are the different paradigms, or these are the different orientations within qualitative research. And really, in kind of highlighting a number of different ones, I want to sort of signal the way in which we can map this field in a number of different ways, and we will map it in a number of different ways depending on where we come to it from and where we practice our research from. So one of the sort of very popular ones comes from US sociologist by training John Cresswell from 1998 originally, a typology of 5 traditions or approaches, biography, which became narrative, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case study. That's still widely cited. It's quite sort of popular as a way of mapping it, even though what gets done doesn't necessarily map onto that in terms of the kind of rich diversity of the field. It doesn't sort of, for me, from my perspective, map the kinds of qualitative that I'm sort of familiar with, or how I would map it. And one of the ones that Victoria and I have found quite useful is what psychologist Stephen Reischer has made as a differential between experiential and discursive or critical approaches. So those he differentiated these clusters of approaches of having different philosophical roots, different ontological and epistemological orientations. That meant that although they were similarly using words as data, what they could claim and what they wanted to claim from those was completely different. So experiential approaches were really kind of those that wanted to kind of be grounded in and reflect participants' perspectives, experiences, and so on, whereas those within the critical and discursive tradition tended to interrogate meaning making at the level beyond the individual person and intentionality. And so those are already 2 quite different ways of demarcating the domain. Another quite popular one has been to kind of highlight what they call different paradigms. So the different paradigms listed here include post-positivist, so the more sort of traditional types of approaches, interpretative, radical, and post-structuralist. And these were articulated by Lincoln and colleagues, and they have, with slight variations, continued. This is what has been described as an evolving space, and what we have is a shifting way of mapping these different orientations. So the most recent iteration of those is post-positivism, critical theory, constructivism, interpretivism, and participatory. So you see a bit of shift and a bit of change there. And what we get is a question then of, is there something that unites qualitative research? And I think, you know, it's a futile question. Denson and Lincoln argued that the open-ended nature of qualitative research leads to perpetual resistance against attempts to impose a single umbrella-like paradigm over the entire project. And I think that is a useful starting point for thinking about quality, for thinking about quality in a specific and a localized way. So does it matter? And it does matter, however, because it matters the types of claims that we make depend on the type of broad orientation to qualitative research that we're doing. And so we often utilize what has evolved from US psychologists Kidder and Fine's demarcation between small Q and big Q. And we find this really useful because we operate in a discipline that's very dominated still by positivism or post-positivism. And Kidder and Fine, basically, we find their differentiation useful for going small Q research is that which largely orients to quite positivist traditions, quite positivist concerns around things like objectivity and reliability and so on. And big Q is those approaches to qualitative that are qualitative research methods and qualitative research values. So the broad paradigms or orientations that I've sort of faded out here on the rest of the slide would underpin most of these would underpin big Q. So big Q is a useful umbrella term, we think, for research that rejects the positivist, post-positivist, neo-realist assumptions, values, and norms, and which centers contextualized, situated, interpretative understandings, partial understanding. And so I'm going to be approaching the question of quality for the rest of this talk through a lens of big Q, with the acknowledgement that if we are doing small Q research, we have different quality criteria. So 100%, how do we do 100% qualitative research? Many of us who do qualitative research are familiar with the critiques that stem from often unrealized positivist or quanti norms, that qualitative research is small, it's partial, it's not objective, and so on and so on and so on. And I find myself, by and large, so immersed in qualitative research that I rarely encounter such articulations now, but I know by talking to others that these things still come up and people have to grapple with them. And those challenges at their heart are about, I guess they're premised on two interlocking elements, assumptions about value and assumptions about quality. So they cast aspersions on both things. They say, what value does qualitative research bring, and how can this be quality research? So we can't really do anything to necessarily change the question of value from the point of view of what I'm talking about tonight. We all know the value qualitative research brings. Many people have articulated this. It's happened, for instance, in the reaction to the British Medical Journal some years ago, when they said, outright that qualitative research was not useful or valuable. That's quite a caricature of the whole debate. But we can grapple more fully with the question of quality, and I think we should, because we need to do justice to the research we do. We need to do good quality research, and we need the quality of that research to be defensible. And so the challenges we might get as qualitative researchers, particularly if we've come through positivism, we're steeped in positivism, the challenges we get can be unsettling. If we get, critiqued or challenged, for instance, that we're using a small sample, we might question ourselves, but more importantly, we might kind of orient to the idea that it actually is a small sample. And in the way we defend it or argue for the value of what we do, we might implicitly be reiterating the idea, kind of still somehow apologizing for this idea that we have a small sample, when we could think about it quite differently and orient to a more sort of positive argument for why and how we do the research that we do. So I think what I'm going to try and do is give us tools for thinking about how we argue positively and how we ensure that we're not inadvertently kind of, I guess, articulating or evoking sort of positivist or quantitative norms. And those criteria, those positivist and quantitative norms, can sort of invade the criteria that we use in terms of our research practice and how we report that research. So I'm going to focus on kind of integrity, methodological integrity or methodological congruity, particularly in relation to reporting, but it's part of a much bigger kind of wider field of considering questions of integrity. So I think one of the things, one of the challenges that we face is the challenge of the messiness, the contingency, the haphazardness, or the sort of impurity in inverted commas of a lot of qualitative research practice. When I was doing my PhD, I was blown away by reading the sociology of science books, like these books, which revealed how much science didn't follow the official public narrative of science, and that what we got instead was a much more contingent, haphazard, random, can't think of the word, course of events and practices, which, while they followed the processes and practice and principles of science, did not necessarily get articulated in the reporting of science. And so there was this disjuncture between science as it's reported in a scholarly way and what actually happens when scientists do science in laboratories and so on. And I think within qualitative research, we often do something similar in that we tell nice, tidy stories, nice, intentional stories about what we do and how we did it. And one of the arguments that some has made is that we need to do a better job of kind of revealing the mess. And I say that recognizing the kind of anxiety that raises even in myself, who feels quite confident, to kind of go, how do we sort of tell a story about our research which doesn't make it seem like I knew what I was doing the whole way I went through and that everything happened exactly as I planned it? But I think part of developing a kind of robust scholarly practice is to think about not, did I know everything I was going to do in advance and was it all deliberate, but were the practices that I have engaged in, are these practices defensible, and how are they defensible? How do they contribute to the integrity of the overall project, regardless of whether or not they follow some imagined blueprint for how perfectly the research should have happened? So a lot of the time, what happens is we get research published, which is a muddle of some sort of more positivist or small q values or norms or practices, and some more big Q norms and values and practices, kind of like a cocktail of different elements. And, if you drink alcohol, you might find cocktails delicious. And if you don't drink alcohol, you might find mocktails delicious. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with the kind of muddling together of things as long as they work well together. And there's a reason for why those things have been muddled together. But too often, what we see is seemingly unknowing muddling of these different elements. And it matters because you can claim different things from different approaches and different orientations to qualitative research. You're interested in different things. You can get at different things. And part of demonstrating the quality of your research is understanding what it is that you're getting at and what sort of things make sense to claim and why. And connected to that is also conceptually the quality criteria that you use. And I will talk a bit about that. Now, we know that some of this happens at the level of publication. We know that some of this muddling happens when people submit their publications for peer review and encounter reviewers who adamantly claim X or Y. So one of my first bits of advice is to advise you to please argue back, to challenge reviewers, to challenge editors, and to have a solid foundation for the arguments that you make. Now, that won't always be successful, but it is worth a try. And I realize that it takes some level of confidence and knowingness to do that. And that is why knowingness or striving towards knowingness is an important part of this talk tonight. So before I move into talking about these issues of quality, I want to just sort of recap some of these challenges and then move into that. So we have the challenge of context, we have the challenge of publication style, we have the challenge of publication length, we have the challenge of the sorts of broader positivist context into which many of us find ourselves either researching or publishing in more broadly. And I'm just going to sort of highlight, for instance, it's something, it's in this handbook. I'll put it up on the slides and I will share the PDF, so I'm not going to go through it now. But when Victoria and I were getting a chapter on thematic analysis in the latest Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research, I mentioned it as inquiry before because my brain is all over the place. We were challenged by the editors on our use of the term data. And for us, it was kind of like a moment to really think about, do we still want to use this term data, and why do we or don't we? And we thought about it a lot, and we decided that we would continue with it. But we wrote a long kind of footnote to explain our deliberative process around why it still made sense for us to use that word, even as many people within qualitative research would, for many, many, many good reasons, critique it. So that is our long footnote. One of the things I often advocate for in terms of quality is if you have to do something that you don't necessarily agree with or you know is incongruous, add a footnote, explain it, highlight that you're being made to do it by somebody else. So there is those sorts of challenges. And then there is just the whole general muddle of what are we talking about when we talk about qualitative research in general, a tangled web of many different values, many different approaches, and learning to understand our situatedness and reflect on that and think about that is just so crucial. And then there is the notorious reviewer too. And I really, really hope that this isn't now the next US president. As I'm recording this, I'm getting alerts for the updates on the presidential election. But I very much hope that Trump can remain here as the notorious reviewer too. This is really important because what we get through reviewing is people demanding, expecting, requiring a universalization of inappropriate standards and practices for qualitative research. So I think we do have to be alert to questioning reviewers and to thinking about the value base that reviewers' claims come from. So, you know, reviewers might question, for instance, you know, the measures that we've taken to generate our data set, or they might ask us why we haven't described how we reached saturation, or they may question us on our lack of multiple coders and the generation of reliability measures and so on. And often these are confidently articulated as things people need to do without a situated understanding of why those practices do or don't make sense for the research that's being reported within the broad paradigmatic or values-based approach of that research. So we have thought about, you know, for instance, some really common quality practices that align with a lot of big Q or small q or any Q qualitative research that often get called out. And would argue that these things are not compatible with big Q qualitative. So saturation, for instance, is incompatible because it assumes a knowable analysis ahead of times. It assumes a knowable, determinable world ahead of times. It assumes that there is a finiteness to the knowledge that we can generate and obtain. And there are other tools we can use to say my data set or my participant group or my collective of items that I use to analyze and develop my analysis were adequate or were good or were better than good, were ideal for what I did. Triangulation is often sought, particularly in some fields more than others. The idea that we should be looking for multiple different data sources to verify our findings. And again, this is problematic from a big Q point of view because it evokes a singular truth. It evokes a singular truth that we can more clearly and more perfectly differentiate by using different data sources. Now, there are different tools and measures which orient to the same sort of idea, like getting a richer or a more nuanced or a more kind of complex understanding of what's going on, which don't evoke a kind of finite, pure, real, true meaning in the way something like triangulation does. Similarly, the idea of multiple coders and establishing some kind of intercoder agreement or consensus approach to coding is really widely talked about, not even just within thematic analysis, some approaches, but also in some other areas as well. And this is, again, really, really problematic because it assumes that there is a truth that is determinable through the research and that truth and that understanding is entirely independent and separate from the researcher, whereas a lot of qualitative approaches, particularly big Q qualitative approaches, will see the researcher as part of the interpretative process and would understand that researchers produce a reading of the data, an analysis of what's going on, something that's important without thinking that that is the single or only analysis. So within that framework, two people coding data, two people analyzing data differently doesn't reveal a flaw inherently necessarily of either of those analyses. It reflects the situatedness and perspective of the two researchers themselves. That's not to say that any research is good research, and we have to have robust practices and processes in place. But as somebody who I cannot remember off the top of my head right now said, all consensus or intercoder agreements demonstrate is that we have trained people to code the same bits of data in the same way. So it is in some ways measuring not the truth in the data so much as the truth of our training of researchers. I won't talk about member checking for validity, but there is good as well literature which has kind of highlighted the ways in which this kind of idea of a practice also can sometimes rely on quite realist and simple realist understandings, and that if we want to engage in processes of validation through our engagement with participants, there are others that might be more amenable to big Q and that they need to be kind of thought through quite robustly. So common quality practices are not necessarily coherent or congruent with both small q and big Q, but they often appear in quality checklists. So particularly in the area of health, I think we are often required to signal the extent to which our research does or doesn't meet the criteria that are required in some checklists. So Janice Morse, who is, I think still, the editor of the journal Qualitative Health Research, noted that the journal does not use checklists in its review process because they consist or describe them as consisting of a list of all the strategies that may be used to ensure rigor and transparency. Beside each item, there is usually a box to check or tick to indicate whether a component is present and a space in which to note the page, Each item is listed in the manuscript. Some of these forms also include space for the editor to make comments to the reviewer. The intent is that the checklist guides the review process to ensure that all components are present in the article and therefore that the article is solid enough to publish. Checklists reflect what has been described as a criteriological approach to judging quality, a kind of assumption that there are universal and stable markers of quality and reporting quality, and a kind of inference often that the more items that you check, the better the quality of your research. Possibly the most cited, probably the most cited and influential, certainly in psychology, but probably in health. It's recommended by numerous journals as correct or correct, depending on how you pronounce it, the Consolidated Criteria for Reporting Qualitative Research checklist. So let's pause and think about this question. Does correct ensure or does it offer a threat to the quality of qualitative research? Well, the answer is it depends. And it depends on where you're coming from and what sort of research you'll do. There are quite a few critiques of COREC, and we have recently published our own, which is different to some of the other ones, but it cites those other ones. So if people are interested, they can go and have a read of it. But whether COREC is something that ensures quality or is a threat or a mix depends to some extent on whether the research is small q or big Q. For small q, there are relatively few incongruities. Although some of us and others have argued that there are still flaws in the checklist, some would argue that it needs improving, some would argue that it needs throwing out altogether. We have argued that it needs reworking on the pragmatic basis that it's widely utilised and is unlikely to be got rid of. But for big Q, we think it's incongruous. We think it is, if it's required by journals, as it is by some journals, then it actually is a risk to the quality and integrity of the research that's reported, if that research is big Q. For instance, we have said that the inbuilt assumptions and the potential consequences of these make COREC unfit for purpose as a tool for assessing the reporting quality of all qualitative research, and even that limited to focus groups or interviews, which it was originally designed around. In effect, our critique is that the implicit model of qualitative research in COREC is both too narrow to be universally useful, but also unnecessarily universalizing of what should be understood as particular and situated practices. Without COREC's applicability being clearly situated and delimited, research which does not follow COREC can be misunderstood as effectively a priori of poor quality. So we have argued that in this paper that for COREC not to introduce methodological incongruity in big Q qualitative research requires reviewers and authors to have some kind of level of knowingness and understandingness of the diversity of values and paradigms and approaches in which qualitative research is conducted, and to be able to assess and judge research on its own terms. And unfortunately, we know that that is not necessarily the case. Now, checklists are not the only measures of quality. We have reporting standards and so on, and I'm not going to talk about these. I just wanted to sort of signal that it's not just checklists, and we should be kind of applying our critical thinking and our thoughtful engagement across whatever type of measure it is that we might be asked to apply our research to, whether it's in the publication process or whether it's in the process of our own research practice, where things might be deployed as our own sort of tools for thinking about quality. So I guess the question is, why, and then why is the reliance on tools like COREC a problem? And from our point of view, it is the over-reliance and rigid application of criteria that is problematic, that leads to methodological incongruence. So if people aren't situated and tentative and partial and able to kind of determine whether or not a particular tool suits the research that is being done. Say a journal takes qualitative research, and if you submit to that journal, you can select which of the kind of quality criteria you wish to report or explain the quality of your research on, rather than having to, for instance, just use correct. So the over-reliance and rigid application is one problem, but the other problem is that the positivist tentacles and tensions within these tools often exist quite implicitly, but they get made kind of concretized into these sorts of tools and criteria. And you are not aware of those kinds of positivist tentacles, and the ways that they have kind of shaped many of the kind of implicit values that some of these tools may rely on, then you can kind of be in a position of unknowing incongruence. So I think if you're not aware or thinking about whether or not existing tools invoke a latent or not so latent post-positivism and scientific realism, which is fine if that's the sort of qualitative research you're doing. But if you're not doing that sort of research, if you're not thinking about whether or not those tools have those assumptions there, you risk doing incongruous big Q qualitative research. So there are all sorts of tensions and problems that arise when these different expectations collide if they are not thought about and considered and explored and explained. So that's a kind of general critique, but at the same time, we know guidelines can be really, really useful. They're useful in two ways, I think. Many ways, but two ways that I'm going to focus on now. One is that they're really useful practically. Like if we are learning, or if we're not as experienced, or if we are working with a team, if we're training people, all these sorts of things, it can be really, really helpful to have straightforward, relatively accessible things that we can point to say these are the sorts of things that are good quality for qualitative research of the kind that we're doing, and these are the sorts of things that we should orient to and aspire to. Guidelines can also be super useful rhetorically. I would argue perhaps more useful rhetorically than practically, but that is a debatable point. They can be useful rhetorically because we can say, no, this is not best practice. This is, the idea that qualitative research has small samples is not in line with the quality criteria for qualitative research. You are using the wrong criteria. Look, our criteria, our guidelines, say the opposite. So we're right, you're wrong, that sort of thing. So the rhetorical power of these is to be able to argue back against reviewers, argue back against editors, argue back against colleagues, whoever it might be, who request that we do things that produce methodologically incongruous and therefore poorer quality, mostly, not always, but mostly, research through the kind of unknowing mashing together, muddling together of different things within qualitative research. So given that we'd had a go at some of these other things, we very tentatively and with quite a bit of discomfort decided we had to put our own hat in the ring, so to speak. And so we worked through and thought about what for us as big Q qualitative methodologists, what do we think characterizes a range of quality practices that align with big Q qualitative. And we developed the big Q qualitative reporting guidelines, which we pronounce BORG. And there's a humor to that for anyone who's a Star Trek fan, which is that this approach is not about following a set of rules and everybody doing the same thing. It's kind of anti the assimilationist orientation of the Borg in Star Trek. But what we came up with was a set of guidelines and a tool for thinking about what sort of claims we might make, what sort of practices we might engage in, and how we make those types of claims, what we orient to in doing so. And this Big Q qualitative reporting guidelines tool is founded in values. It's founded in qualitative research values, or Big Q qualitative research values, and it is characterized by thinking, or a kind of tool to guide us in thinking with methodological congruence, a tool to guide us with thinking about, do the different things I'm claiming here, do the different ways I'm reporting this, do the different parts of this research fit together in a way that makes sense? And if they don't, because they don't always, and they shouldn't always, and sometimes it makes sense for them not to, but if they don't, do we explain it? How do we explain it? It should hopefully give us tools, give people tools for explaining that. And I think the final thing that kind of guided our development of these tools was the notion of reflexive openness, the notion that we should be critically interrogating our own practices and the foundations of those practices, and we should also be talking about and discussing those things. We should not be kind of attempting to hide behind a kind of veneer of neutrality in our reporting. So particularly in Big Q qualitative, discussing the messiness, discussing the contingency and those sorts of things. Now, I know, of course, the argument is that there's never space or time for those things, and that is absolutely the case in so much of the reporting context that we do, and sometimes it's just not appropriate to the reporting that we're doing either. But there are ways and means, I think, now, particularly with online additional materials, that sort of allows for and facilitates that a little bit more. And, so it may be characterized, I guess, by trying to encourage a questioning orientation for the research that we do. And we had a horrendous time with the proofs of this article, but it literally came out last week, so people can go and have a look at it. We are cautious about it because we are cautious about being definitive, and we have critiqued other approaches, and we are certain, of course, that there are also assumptions here that are ones that we may later challenge ourselves on, disagree on, or things that we just simply haven't thought through to the extent that we might want to think them through, like the question of why do we still use the term data, as discussed earlier. So these are tentative. They were developed also orienting to some of those existing tools like COREC, like some of the qualitative reporting standards from the American Psychological Association, JARS Qual, and other reporting measures. So they're not unique, they're not individual, and they're certainly not perfect. So just one moment. So what the JARS, the Borg, not the JARS Qual, contains is a set of recommendations, some suggestions for consideration, as well as information on things that we think are good to avoid or norms to disrupt through the language that we use. So there's a really, really long table in there for people to kind of think about things. But what this is not is a checklist, and it's not a thing that you can just simply go, have I done this, and therefore is my research good? It's not going to be applicable to all qualitative research. It certainly might not even be applicable to all Big Q qualitative research. So that is something that remains to be seen. But even more than that, the foundation of this is that we are trying to encourage an orientation to kind of becoming knowing or becoming thoughtful in our practices and thinking about the need to keep on questioning and exploring the intersections of ontology and epistemology and practice and quality criteria as we do our research. So this is, I guess, a call for never sort of feeling like you've reached the destination of knowingness, but always feeling like there's uncertainty. And that is certainly the case, even as we become more confident and widely published and so on in qualitative research. So I think, you know, I really had hoped to be there. I have no idea whether this has made any sense because I feel like I have rambled completely, but in this set of circumstances, I hope that there is something and that you can take something away. And if there is one thing to take away from this, it would be to be more questioning and to challenge people who say things which don't feel or don't sound right. And hopefully, at the very least, the Borg gives people a tool to do that. So, thank you for listening. Have a wonderful conference for those of you who are going to the training day conference tomorrow. I am so sorry that I can't be there, and I'm so sorry that I haven't been able to be there this evening either. Thank you.